Navigation sounds rather impressive when you say it like that. In reality, our expedition currently involves finding somewhere we can afford to drive to. On this particular occasion, we successfully navigated our way to a little restaurant on the hillside. There was a bridge, there was a river, there was chai, and there were quite a lot of gnats. The river, fortunately, appeared to be having a much more productive day than we were. Below us, the water was rushing through the valley, while around the restaurant the orchard had been left to its own devices, which, as it turns out, was rather lovely. There were butterflies moving through the herbs, wild plants growing between the stones, and all sorts of small things happening that you might otherwise miss if you were simply looking for somewhere to lunch. And this is one of the things I keep discovering about traveling through landscapes. You arrive somewhere expecting to see a view. Then the view starts talking back. The mountains tell you something. The river tells you something. The plants tell you something. Even the rocks tell you something. And occasionally a large pile of rubbish tells you something too. A landscape is never quite as simple as the postcard. So we stopped. We looked around, and I began collecting little clues. There were lichens growing across the rocks in black, yellow, and white. There were silvery artemisia plants growing among them, fragrant, beautiful, and very likely medicinal. I brought some home, and eventually they found their way into my field letters, where they are still releasing some of the most extraordinary scent from the pages. And somewhere between the river, the plants, the mountains, and the rubbish, I started thinking about navigation differently. Perhaps navigation isn't only about knowing where you are. Perhaps it's about learning how to read the place you've arrived in. And that is where this particular story begins. And perhaps this is what a field expedition really leaves behind. Not just photographs, not just notes, maps, or coordinates, but little pieces of a journey. Things I noticed, things I collected, things I wanted to remember. This is Field Parcel 4. It grew out of the landscapes I've been moving through, and the questions that keep appearing as I travel. What do we notice when we slow down? What belongs to a place? And what happens when we begin to see the connections between things that, at first, seem completely separate? I make these field parcels because I want to send some of that journey back out into the world. A little field archive, a story you can hold, a collection of observations, images and fragments from the road, assembled by hand. Here, in the little studio where the expedition begins again, every time I sit down to make something. And perhaps that's another kind of navigation, not finding the quickest way to somewhere, but following the things that make you curious, following a plant, a river, a trail, a question, and seeing where it leads. Field Parcel 4 is ready now. The journey continues. I'm going to be talking about this bundle. There have been quite a few little visitors arriving at my home lately. Orthoptera, moths, little creatures moving through the edges of things. And instead of asking myself how to keep them out, I found myself asking a rather different question. Why have I designed my home in such a way that there is no room for them? I think that question has been quietly changing the way I think about Turtle, because Turtle is becoming less like a vehicle and more like a tiny observatory, a place from which I can travel, camp, work, and observe without needing to take over the landscape around me. Perhaps I could live in a tree house. Perhaps I could live under the stars. Perhaps I could build very little and simply become better at noticing what is already there. Not because it is romantic, although it certainly is, but because I don't want to become a nuisance in a landscape that belongs to so many other life forms, so many forms of intelligent life. And perhaps this is one of the ways I am learning how to be human. We tend to think of intelligence as something that belongs particularly to us. And then you watch a bird fly, you watch an insect navigate a room, you see a plant responding to its environment. You listen to the sounds of a forest at night, and suddenly the world begins to feel very different. There is intelligence everywhere. Not necessarily intelligence that looks like ours, or that asks to be explained by us. Just life, continually adapting, communicating, responding, and finding its way. This is one of the reasons I keep journals. When I began studying the little Orthoptera, visiting my home, I reached for paper. I looked more closely. I tried to draw what I was seeing. And that simple act of putting something on paper changed the experience. I wasn't just looking at an insect anymore. I was observing a life, and I think this is where botany and natural history begin. Perhaps this is where many of our most important ideas begin too. Someone notices something, they write it down, they draw it, they wonder about it, and eventually perhaps another person reads those observations and begins to see the world differently. Every published author began somewhere. Often, before there was a book, there was simply a person paying attention. I've been thinking a lot about this through my own journals, including Wings and Other Pretty Things, where I explore the animals that fly and the ecological relationships that make the world around us so intricate and beautiful. Birds and other flying creatures are particularly fascinating to me because they remind us that the material world doesn't always require the kind of force we imagine it does. There are ways of moving through the world that depend upon relationship with it. Lift, wind, balance, timing, structure. We learned to fly by paying attention to something that was already flying. And perhaps this is true of much more than flight. When I design something for life, I find myself returning to nature for instruction. How can something be gentle? How can it be resilient? How can it use less? How can it cooperate with its surroundings instead of constantly fighting them? How can it make room? These are questions I carry into my work with plants, fiber, craft and herbalism, and perhaps this is why the relationship I have developed with herbs feels so nurturing to me. They have taught me to pay attention to details, to seasons, to materials, to patience, to what is growing around me. I have my own little world that I call Florilia, and I might share it with you one day. Florilia is in many ways an attempt to make those experiments shareable. I've been making botanical crafts, soaps, candles, paper and yarn, and imagining a small traveling workshop where I can continue learning and making while exploring the landscapes I move through. But I don't want to separate that work from conservation. I don't want to make things from nature while forgetting that nature is alive. I want to learn how to make things with the living world in mind. And that distinction matters to me because perhaps the future isn't about becoming better at controlling our environment. Perhaps it is about becoming better at collaborating with it. That is what I am trying to explore through Turtle Tales. The story isn't really about one person traveling across a landscape. It is about a human being trying to understand how to belong to one. And the more I observe, the more curious I become. Because if there is so much intelligence around us, beneath our feet and above our heads, what happens when we look beyond Earth? That is where the next chapter of Turtle Tales begins. From the tiny creatures visiting my home, to the birds navigating the sky, to humans learning to navigate the earth, and eventually to the stars. For a moving ecology studio, navigation is not just a practical necessity. It is a way of learning where we are, reading landscapes, following rivers, watching the sky, listening, orienting ourselves, and wondering whether the universe itself might have more to teach us about intelligence, life, and our place in it. So for now, I am packing this little field parcel, a few books, a few journals, a few pieces of paper, some observations, some questions, and perhaps that is all we really need to begin an expedition. Something to notice, something to somewhere to write it down, and enough curiosity to keep following the thread. I don't know exactly what the next chapter of my life will look like, but I have spent a long time collecting pieces of the puzzle. Now I want to see what happens when those pieces meet other people who are curious too. People who also sense that there might be another way of living, not one that we have to invent entirely from scratch.
So the day has been really chaotic. So I basically didn't film this part because I've already filmed the process of packaging. I've just prepared the next 3 packages, but it's not complete. I still have to, for this big one, I'm going to add a bigger sized painting. So I'll work on that.